Welcome everyone to Crash Course Apologetics, where I summarize the work of Christian scholars in animated videos and interviews. Today we're going to be discussing a video produced by the YouTube channel Crash Course on Pascal's wager. I'm joined today by Dr. Liz Jackson, who has done a lot of work on the topic of Pascal's wager. And Dr. Jackson, will you just briefly mention some of the work you've done on this topic and anything else you think is related to the video?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. So I did my PhD in philosophy at Notre Dame, and my main research is actually in epistemology and philosophy of religion. So those are, two topics very relevant to this video. Right now, I'm an assistant professor at Ryerson University, and especially within philosophy of religion, one of my main areas of research is Pascal's wager. So I've published 2 papers on Pascal's wager, and I actually have a third that's going to be coming out, and a couple that are under review that hopefully will be coming out eventually. So it's definitely one of the main areas that I'm working on right now.
Great. All right, well, let's go ahead and begin. So I'm going to be playing very short clips that hit on some of the main points in the original video. Again, I would encourage you go and watch it in its entirety first so that you get the most out of Dr. Jackson's commentary here. But I'm just going to play a few of the clips, and then Dr. Jackson will tell us what she think went well, what could be improved upon. The goal here is to try and go deeper into the topic of Pascal's wager. So let's go ahead and play clip number 1.
Pascal was a theist, which given his place in history may not be all that surprising. But what is weird is that Pascal's argument for God's existence had very little to do with whether God was actually real. Instead, it had everything to do with whether belief in his existence was practical. This reasoning became known as Pascal's wager, and it's really a gambler's argument for religious belief. Pascal's thinking went like this: either God exists or he doesn't, and reason will never give us an answer. So you must choose blindly to believe or not to believe in God. You can't abstain from choosing. If you choose to believe in God and he exists, you get an infinite reward, heaven. If you choose to believe in God and he doesn't exist, you're not really out much. If you choose not to believe in God and he doesn't exist, you also don't gain much. If you choose not to believe in God and he does exist, you get infinite punishment, hell. Therefore, the smart bet is to put your chips on God existing every time. Pascal argued that if there is the slightest chance that God exists, even if that chance is low, only a fool would bet against his existence given that the stakes are so high. In the face of incomplete information, Pascal decided we should play the odds and believe whatever offers us the greatest benefit.
All right, so that clip was one of the longer clips that we're going to look at, and basically it's just a basic explanation of the argument. What is Pascal's wager with this sort of 2x2 matrix? And I guess I don't think this is a terrible first pass at the argument, and I actually often introduce the argument with sort of a 2x2 matrix as well. But when it came to sort of the consequences for believing or not believing in God, if God didn't exist, it said you don't lose much. And the way I would frame it is not in terms of you could gain or lose a lot versus not much, but actually whether it's infinite or finite. So if God exists and you believe in God, you could gain something infinitely good. If God doesn't exist and you believe in God, what you would lose would be finite. So the main idea, at least behind classical versions of Pascal's wager, relies on this idea that infinite goods trump finite goods, not that it's, big versus not much. So that's kind of one thing I thought would be important to clarify. And I guess also, too, one thing that we can kind of touch on throughout this video and this commentary is that I'm not sure this is a totally fair historical representation of Pascal. I don't necessarily think that's a problem because I think Pascal's wager is actually kind of morphed into this other argument that people talk about that actually isn't fully historically informed. But I do think it's important to be clear about what our goals are. What are we trying to represent here? Are we trying to represent what Pascal actually said and believed, or something that's kind of come to be known as Pascal's wager? So this video is more representing that second thing, that this thing that's come to be known as Pascal's wager, but it's not, perfectly. It's not a perfectly historical accurate representation.
That's a helpful distinction.
Yeah, and then I guess the last thing I just wanted to say on this sort of first pass explanation of the argument. So the version of Pascal's wager that I like and that I defend is going to end up being more complex than this very simple version. So I think it's important to kind of clarify that as well.
Great. All right, well, let's play the next clip.
There are a couple of ways you could argue against this. You might say Pascal's done the math wrong, that choosing to walk the straight and narrow in the service of an imaginary deity actually does cost you something. Like, you might miss out on stuff that you would otherwise want to do, like sleeping in on Sunday mornings, or living a heavy metal rock star lifestyle, or, I don't know, coveting stuff. By this logic, you'd lose out if you abstained from all of that in the name of something that ended up not being real.
All right, so this first clip is basically just the idea that, look, maybe you do lose something by believing in God. You can't sleep in, you can't, do certain things that the Bible says are wrong, or whichever religion you're practicing says are wrong. And I think this is important why we understand the wager is framed in terms of infinite values and finite values. It's not saying you won't lose anything by believing in God or committing to God if God doesn't exist. It's just saying whatever you'll gain or lose is finite. And you could say, well, that finite thing is not much relative to eternity in heaven. So either of those would sort of work as responses to this objection, but I don't think anyone's saying you're not going to lose anything by committing to God or believing in God if God doesn't exist. There's some loss there. It's just going to be outweighed by the gains you could get if God exists and you do believe in God.
All right, well, let's go ahead and play the next clip.
Now, even if you agree that religious belief is comforting, you might still question Pascal's motives. Does believing in something because it's the safest bet really win you a ticket to heaven? Doesn't God want you to be less self-interested when it comes to believing in him? Well, not according to Pascal. He thought how and why you choose to believe doesn't really matter, because the fact is God doesn't care how he gets you, as long as he gets you.
In this clip, Hank Green, which is the guy making this video, he basically says, he brings up an objection to Pascal's wager that's actually a pretty common objection, and one that I get quite a bit, which is, isn't this kind of a selfish thing? Like, is this something God would really reward? If you're just believing in God because you want heaven, because that's infinitely good, that just doesn't seem like a great motive. And so Hank offers a response, actually, on behalf of Pascal, and he says, well, how and why you choose to believe doesn't really matter. And I think he literally says, God doesn't care how he gets you as long as he gets you.
Yeah.
So that he's kind of offering a response to this objection he brings up. And I guess the first thing is, like, I don't think Pascal says this. I mean, Pascal does say some things, which is you could make the wager about action rather than about belief. But he doesn't say that God doesn't care how he gets you as long as he gets you. And I think one thing just to note as we're going through these, he's sort of reading off the screen almost as if he's reading quotes from Pascal, but they're not quotes from Pascal. So I think it's just important that we're on the same page about that, in case that was confusing for people. I don't think that it's clear at all that this is historically accurate in terms of what Pascal would actually say. I do think this is a good objection, but I don't think saying God doesn't care how he gets you as long as he gets you is a good response. So this worry about selfishness, I think there's kind of three main things we can sort of say in response to this. And the sort of thread that unites these three things is that taking Pascal's wager, it doesn't have to be a selfish thing. So to understand that, first I want to talk about what does it mean for something to be selfish. And when something is selfish, you're basically prioritizing yourself over other people. So if there's a bunch of hungry people around you and you take the pizza all for yourself and don't share, that's selfish, right? But it's not selfish to just eat a piece of pizza when you're hungry. And that's what philosophers call self-interested. So it's doing something based on your own goals or desires or needs, but if it's self-interested, it doesn't mean you're hurting someone else or putting yourself above someone else. And we do things that are self-interested all the time. One example I've given before is brushing your teeth. That's self-interested. You brush your teeth because you don't want your teeth to rot. That doesn't mean it's selfish, but it is something you're doing for yourself, right? So the way you could think about this is you could have a version of the wager that's self-interested, but that doesn't mean it's selfish. So it is based on your goals or desires, which those goals those don't have to be bad goals either. The goal can be having a relationship with God. You know, if I pursued this relationship and God did exist, that would be a good thing. I don't see a reason that's a bad motive. But that also doesn't mean it's selfish, because you're not pushing others down or, taking the whole pizza for yourself. So I guess I kind of combine the first two responses. The first is it could be self-interested and not selfish. And the second response is, and you can do it self-interested in a good way, pursuing a relationship with God. And that doesn't seem like a bad motive. And then the third response is, so Mike Rhoda has a great book. It's called Taking Pascal's Wager, and Jordan's actually done a series of videos on that, which I highly recommend. But Rhoda actually talks about versions of the wager that aren't selfish or self-interested, but they're actually totally involving other people. So he talks about wagering for ways that might benefit other people, like close friends or family members, or even wagering in order to please God. So you could even have a version of the wager that doesn't even, it's not even about you at all. So I think that's probably a better response to the selfishness worry than the God doesn't care how he gets you response.
Very good. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at this next objection that Hank Green raises.
Okay, so how do you will yourself into believing in something just because that's where the smart money is? Easy. Pascal said you essentially brainwash yourself into true belief, so that what starts out as self-interest can eventually grow into an honest conviction. And you do this basically by walking the walk and talking the talk, start going to church, start praying, hang out with other believers. At first, it might seem weird and disingenuous, but over time it'll become an ingrained part of your belief system.
All right, so this third objection that he considers is basically, how do you will yourself into believing something? And the answer he basically gives is that you should brainwash yourself. And in my opinion, I just think that's just not a good way to think about it. I don't think Pascal's wager forces us to brainwash ourselves. And that's not the response that I would give in response to this objection. So the way I like to think about it is not brainwashing, but it's a commitment to God. And later in the video, he sort of talks about this thing, a leap of faith. And I'm more comfortable with thinking about it like that. Basically what you're doing is you're taking a chance on something because of how good it would be if things work out, if you took this leap and if you succeeded. So here's an example that's actually from another philosopher, William James. And he considers a hiker who's been hiking around for a very long time. He's out of water, he's out of food, and he doesn't know how to get home. And he finally finds this path that he knows will lead him back home, but he comes across this really wide crevice. And the crevice is just wide enough that he's not sure if he's going to make it, and he definitely has doubts about whether he can sort of jump across that crevice. But because that's his only way home, he goes ahead and he takes that leap anyway. And it's because of how good it would be if he made the leap and he succeeded. And, it's kind of worth the risk. So the hiker isn't brainwashing himself, that's not what's going on at all. He's just sort of considering the costs and benefits of each thing. It's a commitment to jump. So in the same way, I don't think we have to make this about brainwashing, but I think we can make it about a commitment to God. So the other thing I was going to say too is that you can also think about it as a reason to sort of engage in certain kinds of what philosophers call inquiry, but it's basically gathering evidence. So the wager could make you, in a really open-minded way, read and listen to the arguments for God's existence and take really seriously this possibility that God exists. And, a lot of people say, I do that already, but I think studies show it's just really easy to dismiss evidence that doesn't confirm our prior beliefs. So I think the wager can really motivate us to just fight this confirmation bias. And so we can make the wager sort of about the ways that we gather evidence, which isn't brainwashing at all. It's just like exposing ourselves to new evidence and arguments. So I think there's a lot of ways to kind of make the wager that don't require this brainwashing thing.
Very good. All right, well, let's go ahead and look at the next clip.
Now, some critics have pointed out that when it comes to a really usable belief system, you're gonna need more than just fake it till you make it. For example, maybe you are one of those kids raised in a religious household who was just never feeling it. We all know people who were immersed in a culture of religious belief from birth, but end up rejecting those beliefs as adults. And for those people, trying to force yourself to believe is not only ineffective, it can lead to some pretty serious unhappiness, the exact opposite of what a pragmatist wants. So it might be that for a pragmatist, the best advice for non-believers is that they just gotta live their lives. Maybe they'll find God, and maybe they won't, but making yourself swallow it like medicine doesn't seem like the way to maximize belief.
All right, so this is sort of the last objection to Pascal's wager, and he's basically giving this example of this kid who's forced to go to church with his parents, and his parents sort of force religion on the kid, making him swallow it like medicine. And I think the problem with this example is just that the kid is not making this decision or this commitment for himself. And I don't think Pascal's wager says that we should sort of force religion or going to church on other people, but it's about a commitment that you make yourself. So I guess I just sort of want to resist this analogy. I don't think this is a good analogy for thinking about Pascal's wager. I think Pascal's wager should be kind of an individual decision. But also, I think Pascal's wager it doesn't require you to swallow a belief like medicine. It's a certain kind of commitment, and we don't have to think about it as belief at all. But I also think even if you really want to keep it about belief and thinking about belief, I don't think it has to be a forced thing either. And this is especially in cases where your evidence is kind of ambiguous or unclear. So I've given this example before where let's say you have a new colleague at work and you think, well, your colleague doesn't smile very much, and maybe one time you waved to this new person in the hallway and they ignored you, and you realize that you believe they're a bad person. But then you're kind of like, well, I don't really have good evidence for that. I shouldn't judge them so quickly. Like maybe, it would be much better to not believe that they're a bad person, even if I have some evidence for that. You know what I mean? So you could say, I'm gonna believe the best of them until I have really good reason to think that they're not a good person. And you can think about the wager more like that. You're not swallowing it like medicine. You're just saying my evidence is kind of ambiguous. Maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't. But things would turn out a lot better if I believed in God. So I'm going to do that. So it's not this forcing yourself into this. It's more of like a choice, at least in these kinds of situations. So.
All right, there's one final clip that I thought it might be good to include, even though it isn't necessarily about Pascal's wager. And let's go ahead and look at it now.
Okay, so Pascal said that we should believe in God because belief is just practically useful. But Søren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher, went even further. He adopted the famous tenet of Fideism, stating, "I believe because it is absurd to believe." Fideism is the school of thought that says religious belief has to come from faith alone. It says stuff like arguments and evidence actually kill what's great about religion, which is wonder and mystery. Kierkegaard said that the fantastic thing about belief in God is that it's entirely irrational. You can't do it with your brain. You have to take what he called the leap to faith.
All right, so I wanted to talk about this clip, at least briefly, because actually in philosophy of religion, my two main areas of research are Pascal's wager and faith. So I think it's interesting to think about, well, what do we say about faith and how could faith be rational but go beyond the evidence? And this clip talked about this view called Fideism, which is basically you believe something because it's absurd or because it's irrational, and sort of that's what faith is. He did say that religious belief is entirely irrational, so you can't even do it with your brain. That part confused me. I don't really know what he's talking about. Like, we believe with our brains. That's sometimes rational and sometimes irrational, and I don't know what would it even mean to believe something not with your brain. So that part sort of confused me. But I did think it was worth addressing sort of what do we say about this view of faith that says faith is better when it's more or when it's less rational or based on less evidence. Is irrational faith the best kind of faith? And I want to say no. And I want to say you don't even have to say that even if you really like Pascal's wager. So I'm one of the first people that's going to tell you, a commitment to God or having faith, it doesn't require certainty. You don't have to be certain that God exists. You don't even have to think the probability that God exists is like super, super, super high. But I also think it's totally wrong to say that faith is better because you have less evidence for it. So, example, let's say I see a video of my husband cheating on me. It's a clear video evidence, and I just say, faith is better when it's irrational. I'm just going to continue to remain faithful anyway. No, that I'm being irrational, So at a certain point, when you just have decisive proof, you should give up a commitment. And I think if a view says you should never give up a commitment no matter what, that's probably a problem for that view. And the plausible versions of Pascal's wager will say this as well. If you think that there's no chance that God exists, if you have proof that God doesn't exist, you shouldn't take Pascal's wager. You need to at least think that there's some chance that God exists. So I actually think it's, with like this video of my husband, it's really hard to get evidence against God that's that good. There's a lot of arguments for and against God's existence, but it's a tricky issue. And I think most of us aren't going to have decisive evidence that God doesn't exist. So that's also worth noting as well. But the main point I'm trying to push here is just because you like Pascal's wager doesn't mean you have to like fideism. And I think there might actually be a paper here that's kind of exploring the relationship between Pascal's wager and fideism. And I also think, too, so he connects fideism with taking a leap of faith. And I actually think Pascal's wager could amount to sort of taking a leap of faith, but that doesn't require us saying faith is better when you have no evidence for something. So I sort of want to put Pascal's wager and taking a leap of faith in one camp and then fideism in another camp. And I think we can kind of accept both of these, but reject the fideism that he's talking about.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. And this concludes this playlist of videos critiquing the Crash Course series on the philosophy of religion. If this is the first video you're watching, I would encourage you to go back and check out the others that I've done, where several other scholars join me and comment on those videos as well. If you like this video and the content of this channel, then please consider clicking the like button and subscribing. I appreciate all of your support. Thank you.